Hello and welcome to this special webinar from MedTech Insight on key EU and US regulatory changes on the horizon impacting the medical technologies industry. My name is Ashley Yeo, Healthcare Editor with MedTech Insight's sister title In Vivo, and in this webinar we aim to shine a light and prompt further discussion on changes in the world's major regulatory systems. To do this, we have with us the Executive Editor of MedTech Insight, David Filmore, and the MedTech Insight Regulatory Affairs Editor, Amanda Maxwell. Much of David's time is spent poring over the implications of US medtech regulation, and Amanda has been covering EU regulation ever since the first new approach medtech directive came into force in the early 1990s. Welcome to you both. To be a truly global player in medtech, a company needs to have a major presence in the US, the world's biggest market. But does the US regulatory system help or hinder medtech companies in accessing the market? Or is the US too costly, too slow to accommodate innovation, even as it changes now? And as a result, is there a trend of companies launching first in Europe, where it is claimed devices can be cleared to be put into circulation 2 to 3 years faster than in the US? And could this all be about to change, now the US is adopting mechanisms like the expedited access program, which alters pre- and post-market balance in terms of regulatory input for innovative devices? And as we know, at the same time, the EU is on the cusp of introducing the medical device and IVD regulations, which put a bigger focus than ever on clinical evaluation and scrutiny. These long-awaited texts, now published, will surely change how companies approach the EU medtech market. And do these factors show that the world's two biggest regulatory codes have things to learn from each other? So lots of questions and lots of change, but what is clear is that while both codes put patient safety front and center, there are several key differences between them. And to highlight the changes and pressure points in both markets, Amanda and David will each give a presentation for a few minutes, and then we'll have a debate around that and take a peek into the future. So if I may ask Amanda to kick off, please, with her slides on the EU.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Ashley. Yes, these are certainly interesting times. I've been reporting on the EU medtech regulations for some 30 years. Indeed, since the EU directives were first being drafted back late in the late 1980s, the early 1990s. And now we're looking forward very soon to the adoption of a new set of regulations. So this is a good point to reflect on where we are at the moment and on what companies need to do to begin their preparations. To begin with today, I'm going to set the scene by explaining briefly the current regulatory framework in the EU, in other words, the directives that we have in place, by looking at the timelines for the introduction of the forthcoming regulations and looking at how the medtech regulatory environment has become stricter in the recent past in response to measures introduced by former European Commissioner John Dalli. I'll then outline the key changes in the regulations, and finally, I don't think we can leave today without a mention of Brexit. So this slide shows where the EU is now. We currently have three medical device directives: the active implantable, which as it suggests covers active implantables, the medical devices directive, which covers the majority of medical devices within its scope, and then separately the IVD directive. And as you will see, they were adopted between 1990 through to 1998. So the active implantable, for example, is now over 25 years old. So in total, these directives have less than 150 pages. And I say that because it makes an interesting contrast with what we have now. On the right-hand side of this slide, you'll see the regulations that have been negotiated and which are due to come into effect soon. The first is the medical devices regulation, and that will replace the active implantable medical devices directive and the medical devices directive, and separately the IVD regulation, which will replace the IVD directive. So in total, those two regulations have 361 pages, and there's going to be a lot more to come in implementing and delegated acts. So you can see that things are becoming a lot more complex than they were 20 to 30 years ago. So what we're looking at is likely adoption of the medical devices and IVD regulations in early 2017, in other words, at the beginning of next year. The texts of the two regulations were essentially agreed back in June, and there is a 3-year transition period for the medical devices regulation and a 5-year transition for the IVD regulation. It is an estimate that they will be adopted in early 2017. Those early 2020 and 22 dates could move slightly. It's important to note that the original directives and the new regulations are both built on what used to be called the New Approach Foundation and is now referred to as the New Legislative Framework for the Marketing of Products in the EU. And the key cornerstones of this approach to regulation are classification according to risk, so that the products within these directives and regulations are divided up according to risk, and in fact it's up to the manufacturer to assess the risk inherent in their products. And once they have decided the classification of their products, there are different conformity assessment routes which are linked to the risk class of the products. Notified bodies have to be involved in assessing the majority of products, although they're not required for the lowest risk products. And a key feature of the New Approach Foundation is essential requirements. So that's basically a list of requirements in areas such as biocompatibility and sterility and labeling, for example. And these are listed out in detail and show which requirements manufacturers have to meet. And there are standards that are drafted and adopted which offer one means of demonstrating compliance with the essential requirements. They tend to be used, but they are in fact voluntary, not mandatory. Clinical data is a key cornerstone of this approach, and there is a heavy emphasis on post-market surveillance, vigilance, and the safeguard clause. The safeguard clause being the clause that's triggered when there is a problem with a product on the market, and that product either needs to be restricted or withdrawn. And then other key features are risk management, the company having to prepare a technical file, and the company itself making its declaration of conformity. That is opposed to having an organisation do a pre-market approval, for example, in the FDA way. So moving to the next slide. This explains why change is needed and what's changing. When we think of technological development, a great deal has happened over the last few decades. You just need to think about the number of combination products that are out there, developments in mobile health, bioprinting, nanomaterials, companion diagnostics, and many, many more. Products are much more sophisticated these days. Also, the EU has grown considerably from about 12 member states back when the AIMD directive was being drafted, and indeed even the MDD was first being drafted, and now we have 28. Of course, there's been an increased global influence as different markets around the world have worked together within the Global Harmonisation Task Force to begin with, and then that has gradually folded and the work has been taken over by the International Medical Device Regulators Forum. And that's been a place where the different regulators have heard the rationale for regulations in different markets and have learned from each other and adopted different ideas. And indeed, there are the documents that have been produced by the GHDF and then the IMDRF, which are having a global influence generally. But last but not least is the PIP breast implant scandal and the metal hip implant scandal, and both of those shocked not only the medical devices sector, but the public, politicians, and the Commission realised that something had to be done. And the Commissioner at that time, and this is a few years back now, was Commissioner Dalli. He was Commissioner for Health and Consumer Affairs and decided that action needed to be taken. And he introduced an action plan which saw considerable tightening up in the areas of notified bodies and also proposed tighter market surveillance. And a key aspect of this is better coordination among the medical device competent authorities. And as a result of the emphasis on notified bodies, a couple of texts were introduced in September 2013, which resulted in stricter measures for those authorities which designate the notified bodies, and they also resulted in stricter measures for how notified bodies comply with the requirements and how they audit manufacturers. Indeed, this saw the introduction of unannounced visits of manufacturers and their suppliers. So the next slide shows us where we are at the moment. Up at the top we have the current directives, which eventually will be phased out. We're in the stage at the moment on the left, in the middle of the joint plan of actions and have that being introduced. And indeed, that joint plan of actions will feed into the new regulations, or the measures within them will feed in. Of course, the cog for new regulations should proportionately be much bigger than the one for the current directives, given the volume of those texts. So, moving now to the next slide. Sorry, delay here. This slide shows the current and future EU regulatory players. I think most of you will be well acquainted already with the Commission, the competent authorities and the notified bodies. Of course, the notified bodies are the organisations that audit the majority of manufacturers and products and conduct surprise audits now. The competent authorities are responsible for national implementation of EU rules, and the Commission oversees the drafting of regulations and has high-level overview of implementation. But what we're going to have in the future is another layer of governance, the Medical Devices Coordination Group. This will be chaired by the European Commission and comprise experts representing national authorities. So when we come to look at changes common to the MDR and to the IVDR, one of the key ones is tougher requirements for high-risk devices. I'll come back to the scrutiny procedure as we go on, but there are tougher requirements both for high-risk devices, medical devices, and IVDs. There are also stricter measures surrounding the designation of notified bodies and their oversights, and for the notified bodies themselves, as has just been mentioned, which have been brought in through the Dalli action plan. And these unannounced visits by notified bodies are going to be a key issue in the future. The unannounced visits will be taking place once every 3 years, and indeed more frequently for high-risk products or for products where it's perceived that there is a problem. So, looking now at more changes which are common to the two regulations, there's going to be increased transparency This will include transparency among the players in the field and to the public as well, through unique device identification and through the UDIMED medical device database, which will have 6 pillars to it, including UDI, vigilance, clinical data, details around notified bodies. There's going to be a lot more out there and available. There's going to be new authorization for multi-center clinical trials. At the moment, companies have to, or the sponsors have to go to each of the countries to get approval for their clinical trials, and that's going to change. And another key issue is going to be liability coverage, not least surrounding the authorized representative, and there are a lot of concerns about how that will impact authorized representatives in the future and indeed their ability to function because of the risks. So key changes that are specific to the medical device regulation include the scrutiny process, which is going to see a lot tighter requirements for implantable Class 3 devices and Class 2B devices. And this is going to involve a review by expert panels, which will effectively act as a centralized expertise resource. And as we will see, there's an equivalent for IVDs. The scope will include aesthetic products, and it's worth mentioning in particular what these are. The well-being products such as body enhancement products, including dermal fillers, liposuction products, and equipment for brain stimulation, but there are quite a few more products in that list which could be updated. The MDR sees the first attempt at the EU-wide regulation of single-use medical devices, and it'll be interesting to see how that goes. Single-use devices in future can only take place where permitted by national law and as long as under the rules laid down in the medical devices regulation. So member states will still have some say in how they are regulated at national level. I will just mention also at the end of this slide, which you can read for yourselves, that the common specifications that have been around in the IVD directive, which are basically more detailed than standards, these are going to be introduced for the riskier medical devices in future, and these have yet to be drafted. So looking at key changes specific to the in vitro diagnostics regulation, there's going to be the specific regulation of genetic testing for the first time. There's going to be a new risk classification for IVDs, and this is critical because this new risk classification is a complete change from the current system that exists under the IVD directive, and it's going to involve an awful lot of work for IVD manufacturers to become compliant with this regulation. And as a result of the changes in the risk classification and in the associated conformity assessment requirements, notified bodies are going to be involved in the majority of diagnostic products in the future. At the moment, they're only involved in about 10 to 15% of diagnostics, and in future it's going to be more like 85 to 90%, so that's a big change. In the IVDR, we now see companion diagnostics regulated as a group in their own right for the first time, and there will need to be pharmaceutical authority involvement in their regulation. Performance evaluation is also regulated for the first time in specific detail in the IVDR. And there's going to be a scrutiny procedure for some Class D, that's the highest risk IVDs, and a reference laboratory will need to be involved in technical checks, and also a view of an expert panel may also be sought. So coming to my final slide, Brexit, what does this mean in future in terms of regulatory harmony, in terms of a single market and how it's going to change? It's interesting timing because the UK hasn't yet triggered Article 50, which will eventually lead to the UK leaving Brexit. Once it's triggered it, it has 2 years to get out of the EU. But of course, we have the new medical device and IVD regulations on the point of adoption, and under those regulations, the UK will be obliged to introduce them into its law, and companies will be keen to get going as soon as possible to be compliant with those regulations, to be able to trade with the rest of Europe. So it's quite a confusing time for everyone at the moment, and we don't know how the UK is going to negotiate a way forward. I've given some examples of possible trade agreements which may represent types that can be used for the UK to go forward, but nothing is certain, and there are real concerns over the future of notified bodies and authorised representatives in the UK, for example, and there are meant to be some 1,000 UK authorised representatives. Will they still be able to act as they currently do if the UK is not a member of the EU? And the answer to that will probably depend on the type of trade agreement we have. Also, the MHRA, the regulator in the UK, has had considerable influence over the current regulations and is a key spokesperson in EU discussions and often a voice of moderation. So what will happen in the future if the MHRA is not involved? Of course, there are big issues surrounding single market access for manufacturers, and the other question is the future of the EMA. So that brings me to the end of my slides. I'll hand back now to Ashley. Thank you.
Thank you, Amanda. Thanks very much for that very informative summary of the key points of the EU regulatory system, present and future, and as you explained, the rationale for change, but also some areas of concern in there too. And now, if I may ask David to give a US perspective on the regulatory system. Thank you, David.
Absolutely, and thanks, Ashley, and thanks so much for that presentation, Amanda. It was very informative. So I am David Filmore, as Ashley mentioned. I'm going to be talking about what's ahead in U.S. medtech regulations. One sort of distinction from the presentation you just heard from the situation in the U.S. is obviously EU is going through really across-the-board reforms right now, completely new regulations for devices and diagnostics throughout. In the U.S., it's not quite the same, obviously, but there's not an overarching complete change happening, but there are very important reforms in the works and being discussed and happening right now that will have an important impact of how companies should consider bringing devices before FDA in the coming years. So first of all, here with my next slide, I'll just set the scene a little bit with sort of the situation in the U.S. I think industry perception of the FDA process is trending very positive right now. So go back 5-10 years ago, and you'll hear a lot of consternation, a lot of looking at Europe as the sort of a model of innovation and getting to market. And while certainly there remain frustrations on the FDA side in the U.S., there's a much more talk of moving in the right direction in terms of consistency, transparency, and efficiency. Certainly there is discussion among lawmakers, among consumer advocates and others, concerns about safety issues with devices and the need for stricter requirements for getting to market, but that really isn't driving the political context in the U.S. The power players in Washington, D.C. are really more focused right now in their discussions and their language about improving the innovation ecosystem in the U.S. So that's important to consider. Now, there is a consensus concern, I think, to some extent, or acknowledgement that there needs to be improvement in the system for tracking device safety, particularly and performance for medical devices that are on the market. So post-market surveillance, there's a sense that there improvements are needed there to find safety issues sooner. There's also particular areas, and I'm not going to get into too much detail in this presentation, but areas where deeper reforms are being discussed, particularly with diagnostics and combination products. So going from that scene to, what does this mean in terms of changes coming? What are some key directions that are happening in terms of reforms in the U.S. and with FDA? One major one that I think is important to highlight is a move to real-world evidence. So this is the idea of actual data from clinical care of patients rather than just purely controlled trials as a source of data for devices, both in the post-market realm, but also accelerating product development as a tool to support that. Another primary sort of a direction and issue I'm going to talk about in my slides is novel regulatory pathways and tools that have been initiated, launched, or in early stages. There's really a lot of brainstorming going on right now from the FDA and from some of its collaborators. And so this is leading to things like the expedited access program, the patient preference initiative, and some areas, maybe underreported areas I'll talk about regarding the 510K process that could be being updated and enhanced. So for the next slide, I'll first talk about getting real here, the real-world evidence point I mentioned that here. So what I'm talking about when I say real-world evidence is, data from the actual clinical care, device use, and the idea here is to capture that to actually support decisions, to support regulatory decisions for getting products to market, or other types of decisions such as once a product is on the market. So this means using things like registries, electronic patient medical records, claims data from payers and insurers, and other tools. So all these things exist, but there is right now a major push for a new approach to create a network of these different tools and to link them up and to make them more robust and dependable to support decisions. So the idea is to have a more robust data sets and really a cheaper multi-use, things that different parties, including companies, device companies, can share to support their regulatory development. So the origins of this idea of this push for real-world evidence and a system to support it in the U.S. comes from that post-market surveillance weakness I mentioned on the prior slide. So Amanda mentioned the metal-on-metal hip scandal, for instance, and that was really identified, that the safety issues with those products were identified primarily based on the UK joint registries and I think Australia as well. And there was a feeling, and that is one example, but other examples where the U.S. agency and officials talking about how they don't have a tool, maybe the U.S. doesn't have as strong a tool to make those pinpoint issues like that as quickly. So that's a big catalyst for this discussion. And there's also some key building blocks that have driven this discussion towards a real-world evidence system, and that is the unique device identifiers, unique device identification, which is really rolling out over the past few years in the U.S. We just recently hit another deadline for more products to get that on their labels, and so that's going to be an important way to actually track devices and understand what devices you're really collecting data on. And also, as I mentioned, this involves very big investment in coordinating different parties, coordinating different data, getting industry, government, academia, and others on the same page. So there's a lot to do here, and this is something that FDA is pushing very hard on. Another key element of this, though, as I said, the origins of this, how it was originally raised, were about post-market safety. But if you go to a meeting now and you hear, for instance, Robert Califf, the head of FDA, talk, or you hear Jeff Shuren, the head of the Device Center at FDA, talk, they will, one, for sure, I promise, tout and talk about real-world evidence as a major part of their talk. It's something they bring up regularly. But they're going to talk about it more, not so much necessarily about the post-market surveillance part in terms of safety surveillance, but as a tool to accelerate innovation and bring products to market faster. So that kind of builds on the idea of the total product life cycle, constant iteration as a way to innovate in the device industry. So with this idea of using these more robust tools, networks of real-world data that they want to create with coordinators and collaborators, and use that as a way to support the development, regulatory approval, clearance perhaps, of new devices. That means things like novel research designs, which are being championed by FDA. Things like, using, let's say, a post-market registry data as part of your trial, maybe a control group or something else. So not having to just start that from scratch, but using something already in existence. There's also a lot of focus on this shifting of the burden from pre to post-market. If we could depend on something, a very strong post-market system of data, of real-world data in FDA's view, maybe that means less needs to be collected before you reach that point of getting approval and launching on the market. So this is all built into what FDA has termed and is working with other parties on the National Evaluation System for Health Technology. That's something that is being launched right now. It's not something that really has gotten off the ground yet, but it is, I think, something that I see as a major force in sort of how FDA looks at device data and submissions in the years to come. So the reason to pay attention to this from a device industry standpoint is, first of all, financial. Industry is going to be footing part of the bill of this. As I said, there's a lot of infrastructure involved in coordinating these parties. There's been work going on for the past number of years, but that's really still in the early stages. So recently there was a user fee agreement. I'll mention a little bit more about that later as well, which will be going to Congress and potential likely passage by Congress next year, that included some commitment by the device industry in the U.S. to actually help launch this with some of their user fee dollars, was obviously also supported by money from Congress and other sources as well. FDA talks about this as something that's actually going to save resources, though, overall, because of those novel study designs, and that's something that companies will increasingly be able to think about, how to be creative about using data that's out there rather than having to sort of always start trials from scratch and the like. So that's the key element of this. I think FDA sees this as a paradigm shift, really. I'm not sure industry is there yet in general. Obviously, I'm generalizing, but there's still skepticism there. As I said, they did agree to funding this effort in a recent user fee agreement that was just agreed to last month and will be going to Congress for approval in the coming months. But what they agreed to is really to fund a pilot phase of this. So they, I think, want a potential exit ramp as they feel like it doesn't give the bang for the buck that they want. But I would expect this project and this effort to continue and to be an important thing for device companies to consider going forward. So for the next topic, as I mentioned, I was going to talk about some novel pathways and tools being developed and launched in the U.S. for getting products through to FDA. First one I'm going to mention, people may have heard of, and Ashley referred to it in his introduction, is the expedited access pathway. This has been around for just a little bit over a year, actually. What it is a specialized start-to-finish pathway for what I'll call, although FDA isn't exactly using the term, breakthrough devices. These are devices that meet an unmet need for serious, debilitating, deadly condition, things like that. There's particular definitions that have been laid out by FDA. What I mean by start to finish is this is not simply a expedited review process where once you submit, FDA will put you in the front of the line. This is about starting ideally before pivotal trials or even before clinical trials at all, getting in with the FDA early. If you're accepted into the program, getting things like very, outsized access to FDA reviewers that you would normally get to plan a long-term data strategy, coming up with shortcuts to that to get to the market sooner, and then, of course, also getting a quicker review and other advantages. This has actually been more popular than anticipated, this program. When I talked to Jeff Shurn when it was just being launched, the head of the Device Center, talking about really just single-digit number of devices per year that FDA expected would qualify. In fact, there were 17 devices that qualified and that were accepted into this expedited access pathway program in the first year. And there are more that applied that didn't make it, and there are more since then, since the first year mark hit in about July. So there's more coming through to FDA. We'll have to see how they handle all of that, because this does involve extra resources for the agency for sure. In the attention they give companies that go through this pathway. But it is inherently limited in its scope. 17 devices, of course, is a drop in the bucket in the number of devices going through the FDA per year. So it's not something that, it's truly for the highest level of devices that can prove they're meeting a truly unmet need in the market. But I think the key thing to consider is this does have broader implications as well. One key element of this, for instance, of this expedited access program is something I mentioned earlier as well, a pre-market to post-market shift, this idea of saying, okay, we could agree on a long-term data plan that involves a certain amount of data collected before you get approval, and then continuing that process post-approval. And because we planned that and we have reliance on post-market data, we could maybe let you have a shorter trial, less patients perhaps, or use certain surrogate endpoints instead of ultimate, more clinical endpoints. So there's a lot of things that these expedited access pathway devices are supposed to be able to negotiate with the agency on that point. But I think that idea of the shifting the burden is going to expand, and FDA wants to expand out to other products as well when they could come up with creative ways of doing it. And that will be true for other things that might be developed in a creative way under the expedited access pathway, with the idea I think FDA has to hopefully come up with interesting ways of approaching new devices and then expanding that out to other devices that aren't necessarily part of this program. In the next slide, I'm going to talk about another very big push from FDA, and that's called, they've termed it the Patient Preference Initiative. So this is about, listening to what the patient wants, which sounds a little fluffy, a little soft. Of course you listen to what the patient wants, but this is more specifically about quantitatively injecting patient feedback about risks and benefits into development and regulatory decisions. So meaning we're going to take feedback in qualified, certified, validated surveys, or for instance, in patient-reported outcomes as part of a pivotal trial, and we're going to make that one key factor in how we decide, is this product truly the risk safe and effective? Does the risk-benefit ratio work out appropriately? So an example of this, the FDA has already put out some guidance on this point, but they've also started applying it. They started initially applying it in the obesity device space, but they plan on certainly are not just looking to limit it for there. But in the obesity device space, there was a recent example from last year, the Maestro device, which is a neurostimulation product for managing weight. And it did not meet its primary endpoint, which can be sometimes a problem to get through FDA. But it's ultimately approved, and according to the FDA and the company, the key reason was a validated survey data, patient survey data from obese patients that suggested a willingness to accept a little bit less of a benefit, but a certain benefit they wanted, even if there's a certain level of risk. And that was enough based on the data they had, even though it didn't meet the primary endpoint, to get approved. So that's a key thing to think about now in terms of thinking about novel ways of getting to market, novel ways of collecting data, taking into account what patient feedback you could use to potentially accelerate the process. The last thing I'll talk about, so all this, the Expedited Access Program, Patient Preference Initiative, truthfully, a lot of that is going to be mostly related to PMA-like devices or perhaps de novo devices. 510Ks don't get as much advantage for those because they don't always involve clinical data, and although they sometimes do. And so I don't want to ignore the 510K program, which of course is how a majority of products get on the market in the U.S. and very important. So I was going to highlight a few things, oncoming changes that I think are important for 510Ks very quickly, and that is, first of all, a move to electronic submissions. So what I'm talking about there is right now you cannot submit a 510K to the FDA over the internet. It's paper and you need a disc, DVD, CD. So there is now steps being taken to try to make that so you can in fact do that. And we're not there yet, but I think there's a goal over the next number of years to run and pilot, and there's been new commitments to on the IT side to make this happen. That will mean not just the idea of being able to submit it over the internet, but what it requires, and what's been a challenge and why they don't have it yet, is creating a standardized submission platform for 510Ks. In other words, having fields more like a TurboTax form. I don't know if that's a U.S. reference, perhaps, but a form for completing the necessary fields of a 510K that come up in a somewhat standardized format for every submitter. So that's something that could speed the process, I think, in various ways in terms of the actual submission process, but also FDA's ability to review these applications in a consistent manner. The other point about 510Ks I wanted to bring up, and a change I think could be coming, but we'll have to see, is a reviving of the third-party review program. So this is actually not a new thing. Going back really like 20 years, there is a program in the FDA to allow third parties, maybe notified bodies-like parties, to review 510Ks instead of the FDA performing the primary review. It's supposed to save time, money, perhaps, for industry. It hasn't really panned out. it hasn't been an efficient process. It hasn't been an effective process for a number of reasons. So it really is not employed in many cases. There has been a more recent commitment related to that user fee agreement that I mentioned a little while ago for FDA to try to bring this program, improve it, and make it so it's used and can be used more often for appropriate devices. Recently, there was a draft guideline put out by FDA, and there's been other proposals as part of the user fee agreement to improve the third-party entities, the auditors, audit them, and create better standards so they could do a better job, and also potentially go to Congress to change the standard that delays this process, which is the fact that FDA needs to review third-party reviewed 510Ks before they can actually be approved. So FDA is considering the idea of removing that step and allowing it to just truly go through a third party without FDA's review. So like I said, this is a system that exists right now. You can apply it, but it's the steps that are anticipated to be taken over the next 5 years or so that could increase its use. The last bullet point in this one, I mentioned a slow march to harmonization. I think just worth pointing out that I think both of these issues, electronic submissions and third-party review of 510Ks, supports a move towards perhaps harmonizing in some way, not in a complete sense, towards with Europe and other entities, since those creating a standardized form for 510Ks and having something that's a little bit more similar to what you envision in the EU with third parties involved rather than a government review. So that's something to think about, although it's not the explicit goal of either of those programs. And for this slide, my last slide, I just wanted to point out some of the particulars of how some of these reforms are getting adopted into the system and other reforms. So all the things I talked about are happening now. They're things that FDA is working on, have launched, or are trying to launch, as I've mentioned. But for things to really get incorporated in a long-term sense into the U.S. system, they need to be, in some sense, passed into law or inked into regulation, something that really makes them a clear cut and a long-term reform for the system. Interestingly, there's actually two opportunities, one this year and one next year, for legislative change in the device regulations in the U.S. to happen. That's very rare for there to be two realistic possibilities for there to be legislative reforms for the device industry in a row. So one is certainly not a guaranteed one. I know there's only several months left in the year, but there's you may have heard of the 21st Century Cures Act in the House and a similar piece of legislation that's being worked on in the U.S. Senate. So this is a legislation that could, I think, still has a possible chance, although I'm not certainly guaranteeing it, to go through in some form this year, as it could support some sentiment of bipartisanship and legacies for various lawmakers. So that would include what's been called the breakthrough pathway for devices. That's actually what essentially is the expedited access program that I discussed further, but it could be a slightly expanded version of that, and it's certainly one that would embed the system into the law for the long term. There's also more streamlining elements to the bill for devices. It's all about this idea of really bringing products to market faster or with less paperwork and other burdens. There's also a focus in these discussions about, as I mentioned, diagnostics and combination products and sort of potential deeper reforms for those. The next potential opportunity reforms, and this one is more guaranteed as a piece of legislation will happen in 2017, and that is the user fee reauthorization that I referred to. Industry and FDA came to an agreement last month, and what that does is FDA agreed to paying more user fees for the next 5 years, which will end up being just shy of $1 billion before inflation. That's about $300 million more than they have been paying for this current user fee system. That's this current set of 5 years. And in return, FDA has agreed to various commitments. Some of this that includes new performance goals and other sort of timelines and deadlines for being efficient in the reviews. It also includes moving forward on many of the things I talked about today, things like the Realworld data system, things like a patient preference initiative, and some of the 510K points I pointed out. So that's something to look out for as a key vehicle for change, and other things could come up with regards to the user fee reform as well. That's all I wanted to talk about today. I'm happy to get to discussion next. I'll hand it over to Ashley.
Thank you, David, for a fascinating look into an evolving system. perhaps several positives in there too, especially within the section you developed on the getting real themes. Thank you very much to both of you for your useful and insightful presentations. And now we've had both describing the main changes and giving an indication of which way the wind is blowing within the world's two major regulatory systems. The wind might be blowing in different directions that we've just picked up from both presentations. But what underpins both is a drive to make the improvements that ensure long-term sustainability and allow innovation to flourish, bearing in mind cost, value, and patient safety. Taking up that last point, the patient safety equation, can I come back first to Amanda? Looking at the long discussions that have finally produced the medical device regulation and the IVDR, the differences along the way between the Commission, the Council, and the European Parliament, and the changes that still might yet be made, do you think that perhaps the industry, from your point of view and from the point of view of the industry and notified bodies, do you think the balance they've arrived at with the MDR, just to focus on devices for a moment, is right?
Well, I think the main thing, Ashley, is that there is immense relief that they are out after the number of years that they have taken to negotiate, an immense relief that there has been political agreement on these texts. When we talk of balance and we think of the length of the regulations, 361 pages plus implementing and delegated acts, it may seem difficult to accept that they are indeed balanced, especially in the light of the costs that this is going to introduce for industry and indeed for notified bodies, because those costs will need to be passed on. So the question is this all proportionate? Certainly, I think there's general acknowledgement that the level had to be raised and that we needed to have more confidence in the EU's regulations. But there have been questions about whether there's been sufficient evidence for the level of increased stringency that we now have. And certainly some people are asking whether the evidence behind the unannounced audits by notified bodies that are already taking place are in fact justified. So in terms of balance, I think that probably the jury is out at the moment, and we'll have to see what people think when they have fully complied, met the costs, and the whole system is working. I think that's something we'll have to review.
And of course, on top of that, and yet to be established are the implementing regulation and delegated acts yet to be developed, will result in more compliance needs for the industry and further costs. Do we have any indication at this early stage where we are with those decisions?
Not at this stage. There has been talk that the European Commission has been getting on with those in the background, but it certainly doesn't have any authority to adopt them. So I think we're going to have to wait a little while, but once the regulations themselves have been adopted, hopefully at the beginning of next year, then I think we'll start to hear more and more about the implementing and delegated acts. I think roughly, I've forgotten the exact number now, but I think roughly it's around 50, and that's an awful lot of acts to produce, and it'll take a long time to draft and adopt them.
Yeah, a lot of extra work. And US companies have obviously been tracking closely the developments of the MDR and the IVDR, the twists and turns. Dave, what concerns have you been picking up from your talks with the US industry?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think, obviously many companies are playing, in both markets in the EU, US, and no matter their headquarters. So I think there's a lot of probably, similar questions and concerns of what Amanda mentioned. It's with the global economy as it is. I mean, 5 to 8 years ago, as I mentioned, Europe was portrayed by the U.S. Device industry as sort of the golden hill of innovation, FDA comparatively as more opaque, hard to work with regulator. That tone has really changed, part because of the positive or adjustments by FDA, but I think there's a very close watch on what's happening in the EU and how that sort of impacts that dynamic. So, I think it really partly remains, how is this going to be implemented and what are the details that come up once these regulations are adopted and then go into force.
Thank you. And the US has been busy adding incremental improvements, as you explained in your slides, to the FDA and CDRH system of regulation, rather than making the wholesale change that the EU has opted for. The EU, a driving theme for the EU were patient safety themes. How much of the changes in the US of late have been driven by patient safety considerations, or is it a more wider ecosystem improvement drive that we're seeing?
Yeah, I mean, patient safety continues to be an important conversation in the U.S. Just a few days ago, for instance, 7 lawmakers, a few from each party in each political party, sent a letter requesting hearings to the leadership of the committees in the U.S. House on specifically looking at lapses in FDA oversight of device safety and what needs to be done about that, referring to some particular devices such as power morcellators, for OB/GYN surgery, and a birth control device, which have had some high-profile issues recently in the U.S. So there's an undertone of that discussion, but really, as I mentioned, the political powers at be right now in the U.S., I think, are not being driven as much in terms of the reforms themselves by that. It's more about improving the innovation ecosystem, more really aligning with, frankly, the industry priorities and agenda. So while there's some push in some quarters for, say, stricter standards for getting products to market, that's really not driving the discussion, and it hasn't been the primary push for reforms in the past several years. I'm talking about going back a little while. It's a different story, and if you look at, for instance, going back to 2011, there was an IOM report, recommending to dump the 510K system, it's completely, and that's really more would be a wholesale change, but that's not going to happen. There's really a lot of focus on, what tweaks could be made to speed up the system, and perhaps as that happens, it's also possible some changes to sort of add stronger oversight on the patient safety focus will also find their way in there.
Okay, and talking mainly of tweaks to the system, then has the industry bought into these piecemeal changes that are coming in with under the FDA? Is it supportive? And what progress are we seeing and support perhaps for things like the 21st century cures that you mentioned in your slides?
Yeah, industry strongly supportive in general of that legislation. I think there is it's happening. It's now going through the U.S. Senate under a different name and so with some changes. I think the U.S. FDA had concerns with that piece of legislation as it was originally presented because of the additional amount of resource burden that it would put on the FDA. So, but some of those concerns are being addressed as they look at those pieces of legislation in the U.S. Senate. But yeah, there's strong support in the industry. There is pushback from some in the healthcare and consumer community that these pieces of legislation are too much about facilitating the path to market and not enough about protecting patient safety. But it's unclear that those arguments are having a major impact on the debate going forward with those.
Okay, and in terms of speed to market, in terms of looking at what's over the fence, both in the EU and the US, industry is most concerned with the speed to market, the associated costs, the user-friendliness of the system, the predictability of the system, and its durability. On this question of speed to market, the EU, as you said, has long claimed an advantage over the US, and the EU industry was especially vocal about its advantage when it was fending off the restrictive European Parliament proposals during the MDR debate. Dave, does that still hold good, or are there some areas or instances where the 510K system is improving and the other elements that you mentioned? Are we perhaps getting to a point where the US is overtaking the CE marking for speed?
Well, I don't know if I'd go that far at this point, but of course it remains to be seen, what happens ahead. I mean, you're right, going back to, a number of years ago, 2009, 2010, 2011, let's say, you couldn't go a day without, for instance, the U.S. Trade groups talking about how Europe was a great model and U.S. was too slow and too opaque. You don't really hear that anymore, but I think that's because of the direction of change, not necessarily that yet there's been a sort of overtaking at this point. I mean, FDA has made some actual gains, no doubt. PMA times in particular have improved. Clearly, it looks like now, starting in the most recent years from several years ago, there's really been an increase in efficiency for PMAs. 510Ks have improved in the past few years from the peak slow years when the device industry was not very happy in that sort of 2009 to 2012 period, but they actually still aren't down to the levels they were at the beginning of the 2000s. So, I really don't think you could say for sure, where things are. I think it might depend on the product area you're talking about. Perhaps, as we move to some of these reforms in Europe for the high-risk products and FDA gets better with PMAs, you could start seeing some things to think about with speed and what industry thinks of the two systems. But I think how this new reforms in Europe is actually implemented, it seems to me, would really, kind of impact to me, like, that's gonna determine what the comparison is ultimately. I just point out when the 510K system was originally established in the U.S. in the 70s, it was not meant to be the system it is today in terms of how much it is used and how much it is relied on. So things change once regulations get implemented. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out.
Indeed, yeah. So the EU is still perhaps the market of choice in terms of speed. But Amanda, can I ask you, how important is it to companies in the EU and working in the EU that the EU system has maintained its heavily post-market structure?
Well, Ashley, just as, of course, for US manufacturers, the speed to market remains very important in the EU. But there's no doubt that the EU has significantly tightened up its pre-market requirements in the context of the medical device regulation that's due to take effect, especially in terms of clinical data, for example, and scrutiny of high-risk devices. So that much for the pre-market tightening up, but it hasn't lessened to any extent the emphasis on the post-market side. In fact, post-market clinical follow-up has become even more pivotal, especially for the high-risk devices. And you'll see a heavy emphasis on the post-market clinical follow-up as a thread throughout the regulations. As for the view of industry on the post-market emphasis, well, for them, of course, it's a heavy workload, and with the increase on the pre-market side as well, it's more costly for them, both in terms of pre-market and post-market. And the question that many of them will be asking is whether actually this is proportionate. But of course, one of the huge benefits of this that they're hoping will come through is confidence in the system, because there have been a lot of questions about whether the EU medtech regulatory system was adequately stringent if episodes like the PIP breast implant scandal and the metal-on-metal hips could happen in the EU. So basically, the regulators over here have done everything they can to try and seal off the possibilities of things going wrong, and many believe that that's necessary. Certainly interesting to hear from Dave that the US is considering putting more emphasis on the post-market side, and it'll be interesting to see how that might affect their pre-market requirements. And as Dave says, we're in a constant state of flux with the regulations, and as we go forwards, it'll be interesting to see whether companies consider that the EU market is still the market of choice, or indeed will the US market perhaps become easier in some ways. I know I had an interview with John Brennan of MedTech Europe this morning, and he was arguing that, well, Europe still has its essentially new approach regulations, and that's not going to change, and that's what's made Europe so popular. But for my own part, in looking at the regulations as they are, reading those texts, anticipating what might be in those implementing and delegated acts, and knowing that we'll have yet more guidance to come in the EU, I think the EU may become quite a tough market to understand and within which to do business in the future, particularly for companies that are coming from the US. or indeed from anywhere else in the world.
Yes, indeed. Yeah, and you mentioned confidence in the system. Part of that in the EU has been, I think, tightening up the activities of the notified bodies who are operationally in charge, so to say, in terms of what market access in the EU. And I'd like to ask about the sustainability of the EU system pivoting around notified bodies. Notified bodies are now shrinking in number. Wondering if they can still cope with the extra workload that's being put their way with fewer numbers. I understand that we had something like 80 or so a while ago, but that's coming down now. So, Amanda, what realistically is the outlook and the worries here for companies working with notified bodies? Because it seems to be a live concern, which probably is only set to grow in size.
Yes, you're quite right, Ashley. After the new regulations, this is perhaps one of the biggest topics that we're looking at the moment, the sustainability of the current system with these new requirements that have come in for notified bodies, which have influenced the number that have wanted or indeed been able to continue operating in the medtech space. And yes, we're down to about 60 notified bodies now, and there are predictions that will drop even further, and that we'll be likely to have only around 40 by the time we have the redesignation of the notified bodies under the new medical devices and IVD regulations. So this is the impact of the tougher oversight, and the new regulations will bring in even more stringent requirements. And the timing of all this is critical, because manufacturers will have to demonstrate compliance with the new regulations. And in the case of the IVD regulation, this is particularly huge because, as I mentioned earlier, about 10 to 15% of IVD manufacturers currently involve a notified body, but this is going to flip over to being around 85 to 90%. So there is going to be a surge of manufacturers needing the support of notified bodies, auditing from notified bodies, just at a time when the notified bodies themselves need redesignating, and at a time when the notified bodies are already struggling in terms of capacity. And there are already companies out there, and apparently especially SMEs, who aren't able to get their products through the notified body system at the moment.
Yes, more stringent requirements, and that equates to more costs for the industry too. So I'd like to ask you a couple of questions briefly about the cost of paying for the regulatory system. Amanda first, perhaps, and specifically on the workload that the notified bodies are having, and the fees and the costs that they're the fees that they are going to have to charge to the industry. How bearable do you think this is going to be for the players in the EU market?
Well, in the EU, there are going to be a lot of pass-on costs. Notified bodies are going to have to employ more people. They may need to pay fees to the Commission for advice provided by expert panels and laboratories, and none of this comes cheap. So I imagine the manufacturers are going to pay highly, and this is going to be passed on to patients. My understanding is that the notified bodies will make lists of standard fees publicly available, and also that the notified bodies are obliged to operate fairly and reasonably, taking into account the SMEs, but I don't know quite how this is going to work.
It's interesting. I'd like to ask Dave too, paying for the service in the US, you were referring to MDR 4, the fee amendments, just been agreed in principle. Can you give us a take on the broad headline themes as far as industry sees it, and perhaps how it compares to the previous MDR? Is this a good outcome, do you think, coming up for the industry?
Sure. Yes. No. It's a timely topic. So, I mean, it will involve more fees paid by industry over the coming 5-year period compared to the just ending 5-year period. about 300 million plus inflation more over that period. So, it could be somewhat more than that in fact. So, as good negotiations go, that's more than industry, I think, wanted to pay, but less than FDA wanted in their heart of hearts. So and that's how these things happen. So it does support, I think overall, though, both sides are relatively happy with the deal that involves from FDA, new performance goals that they've agreed to with programs that they previously didn't have to meet certain timelines on. So things like the pre-submission process, which is something that is really growing in use in the U.S., and that's an opportunity for a formal interaction with the FDA before you, for instance, started a clinical trial, before you submit your application for approval or clearance, to request a sit-down meeting or a phone meeting, et cetera, to talk about what FDA's expectations will be. And so now there's sort of timelines around that process that there will be, assuming this user fee agreement comes to place. And similarly for some other programs, such as the de novo clearance program, which is something that is really starting to pick up in use as well in the U.S., which is a way to get a pathway for moderate risk devices that don't have a sort of comparable predicate on the market. So FDA is trying to make that work quicker, and they're going to be holding themselves to new deadlines to do that. There's also a lot of funding for things I talked about during my presentation, real-world evidence, patient preference initiative, and other things. That's where this extra user fee money is going to go, in addition to, generally to support this hiring and retaining staff at FDA. So, I think both are basically happy with it. I think FDA still is concerned about some of the resource burdens that will be put on it, despite the extra user fee funds. When this user fee bill, what has to happen next, process-wise, is it needs to be submitted to Congress, and by next year of September, it needs to be approved by Congress to go into place. And while doing that, they don't just have to stick with what sort of FDA and industry agreed to. There can be other reforms tacked on to that. So, whether it's things that might put more burden on FDA or things that might try to strengthen oversight of safety issues. So we'll have to see what that happens and the type of burdens that come into play there.
Okay. Can we just briefly look at that issue from the point of view of the companies under cost pressure? And perhaps a question to both of you. Generally, do you think that regulatory systems are in danger of pricing themselves too high to guarantee the flow of affordable innovation and patient care in both the US and the EU?
Can I go first?
I'm happy.
Yes, Amanda, please.
Absolutely, Amanda. Go for it.
Thank you. Well, yes, this is certainly a question that we should be asking ourselves. Somebody's got to pay for the sector to meet these much tougher and more complex requirements, and the cost will inevitably be passed on to patients. And given these regulations are so complicated, and that some 85, even 90% of the industry is made up of SMEs, there's going to be very few companies that will have sufficient in-house expertise to manage regulatory compliance. So they'll need to bring in expertise, and this will be at high cost. And yes, I think this will considerably impact the affordability of innovation.
Thank you, Amanda.
On my end, I think that, one thing I would look at this beyond just sort of the fees paid, of course, and just like the overall cost to companies to develop products and the clinical trial costs. I think that, yes, there's no question there's more demands that also on the U.S. side. But I think another issue, we talked about speed to market, but I actually think predictability is a key issue. When you're talking about small companies and pricing out of the market, I mean, the key thing they need is funding from venture capitalists and other sources. And I think the key thing those parties look at is, can they predict what's going to happen? Can they bet, okay, they'll need this amount of time, this amount of resources to do this type of study, get to the market? And I think that to the extent that FDA is improving predictability, which I think the consensus is that, yes, they're moving in that direction, and that improves that predictability, which may not be the case in the EU, but in the US, I think may be happening. That could actually help in this regard. But we'll certainly have to see how that comes along.
Thank you. On that theme of predictability, just to return very briefly to the medical device regulation, Amanda, individual elements built into that look likely to slow the progress and the process, as you mentioned, scrutiny and clinical evaluation. Can you tell these extra hurdles, are they going to make it harder to get to market? this is seen as a strength of the system in some parties, but in other ways it's impairing access to the market. Can you comment on how that's seen by the industry?
Well, yes, the industry does view it as inevitably slowing access to the market, and when you see the list of timelines that are contained in the regulations for those companies that need to take the scrutiny procedure, they're quite eye-watering and quite daunting for companies and involve a lot of different bodies. So I imagine that companies are viewing this with some trepidation, especially if they're the first ones to go through the process. On the other hand, of course, there is the question of the degree to which this will increase confidence.
Okay, so companies are getting used to living in the real world, and Dave in his theme mentioned real-world evidence becoming much more important, the value-based equation becoming ever more important as measuring outcomes replaces fee-for-service concepts. Dave, can I ask you what effect do these changes have on a company's R&D policy, the investment in product lines, and the market it chooses to access?
Yes, I mean, when it comes to, I mean, obviously there's a lot of when you're talking about real-world evidence, you're talking about value-based data. You know, those are two overlapping issues in a sense. You have to, I think the key way to think about this is the point about that's been drilled into companies' heads over the past number of years of the need to think about your different goals, including regulatory approval and reimbursement earlier in your development process. And I think this focus on real-world evidence perhaps facilitates that approach. So you know, thinking about these new sources of data when you're at the very beginning of your development process, before you've done your main trials, thinking about how you can use some of the tools, either real-world data tools in addition to other data, tools to show, support a safety effectiveness decision, to support a post-market surveillance, but at the same time support a cost effectiveness of your product and how it sort of will be incorporated into the system. So I think when it comes to some of these like new tools, greater reliance on registries, claims data, et cetera, there's a value in putting those together in terms of supporting all various goals you have, in addition to just basic market acceptance data as well. So it really does, you can think about this as a new approach of really putting everything in a bucket, thinking about your pre-market needs, your post-market surveillance needs, and your reimbursement needs all at once. I think that's a key thing to be thinking about for companies.
Okay, thank you. And that's sort of a new approach in its own way for the US. Can I finally like to ask you about potentially disruptive elements for the global medtech industry, specifically Brexit and the presidential change coming up later in the fall. Brexit, when it came about, was a surprise to many people. It will change how the EU is regulated in terms of medical device. It will change how the UK is regulated principally. And the EU will lose valuable MHRA input into a liberal free market and science-based thinking, as Amanda mentioned. Amanda, could I just revisit that final slide that you put up, and if you could document the fears ahead that you see in regulatory circles from what is yet to come, and we don't really know what is yet to come. Will industry and innovation potentially suffer from what we have decided?
Well, yes, it's very difficult to make predictions. I think what characterises this area more than anything is the uncertainty. There are not enough indications from the UK government which direction they're going in, and they seem to be constantly undermined. But all we can really speak about is industry's concerns. Will there still be a single market that UK manufacturers can benefit from, or will they have to manage additional hurdles before they can export products into the EU in future? I mean, obviously that's something that everybody wants to avoid, and from everybody's expectation it seems to be that it will be avoided, but there are so many potential hurdles before any new trade agreements are negotiated that really we don't know how it's going to work out. I suppose we can only work with what we do know, and what we do know is that there are regulations that are about to be adopted, that the MHRA has played a significant role in shaping, and that the industry has to take it on board while the UK is still a member of the EU. And hopefully or presumably, the emphasis will be on finding a trade agreement that will include a mutual recognition or an acceptance of EU requirements, and in fact the regulations will be our regulations of the next 20 years, for example. But the big issue is we don't know, and the other big issue is we don't know for certain what will happen with our UK notified bodies and authorised representatives. And when you consider that we perhaps have more authorised representatives than any other country in Europe, and these are the bodies that represent companies who are coming in from outside Europe. And when you consider the size and importance of our notified bodies and the respect that they have, these would be huge losses to the EU itself. And I should think that for the EU, they are considerably, or the companies in the EU are also considerably worried about how they're going to trade in the UK if the UK makes a move that does not involve the mutual recognition of medical device regulations. So the big issue is uncertainty, and I think we all hope that the medical device regulations will continue to apply in the UK and that we'll continue to be able to operate through some kind of agreement with the rest of the EU under those regulations.
Yes, yeah, a potentially destabilising situation for all. Dave, can I ask you for a brief comment on the US view of Brexit as seen for medtech and for medtech regulation particularly?
Well, yeah, I think that it's mostly a amount of questions and little answers. Is my sense. I mean, it's really what is. I think the question is, is UK, what direction are they going to go? I've heard the across the spectrum from, obviously sticking, in some way, basically sticking with the EU approach to their own approach to other countries like FDA, and just the unpredictability of it is the key sort of message I get.
Thank you. So from what you've said and the slides that you've presented, it's clear we're at a time of change. For the players in the EU, things are not likely to get any easier anytime soon, as Amanda expressed. In the US, it's a different ballgame entirely, and the consensus seemed to be that industry is increasingly not content but happy with the direction that things are taking. Jeff Shuren, as Dave mentioned, is becoming a user-friendly person for the industry in a way that perhaps hasn't happened for many years. And the agency is as good as it's been for maybe a decade or more. There's a confident and settled feeling in the US. And just to wrap up, both of you, can I ask both of you to give your own brief takes on the mood of companies at present in respect of the regulations in their markets, and perhaps what still needs to change in your view? Maybe I could ask Dave to go first.
Sure. So as a sense I give, and as you suggest, it's sort of an overall good move in terms of moving in the right direction in terms of FDA policies and the U.S. regulations. But of course, certainly a push. I'm not saying, I don't want to paint an overly rosy picture. Of course, there's frustrations among companies, and there's still interest in speeding up the system and adding more transparency in certain parts of the process. I will say that the real change and in a sense focus for reforms in the U.S. I think going forward will be more about, from the industry standpoint, more focus on the reimbursement system. Maybe a topic for another webinar, but changing the speeding the path to gaining coverage and appropriate payment for new innovative products is considered a big challenge now and growing, increasingly bigger than just simple market approval. So that's something I think to look out for in the years ahead. But in terms of the regulations and FDA, I think with the Cures bill and some of the expedited access program that's already been established on the user fee agreement, and even looking on from the White House, things like the cancer moonshot, which is we're focused on coming up with ways from the Obama administration of streamlining new cures for cancer. They're really aligning closely with industry's priorities of accelerating the path and making the path to market easier and more predictable.
Thank you, Dave. Amanda.
Gosh, it really does sound quite positive in the US at the moment. Well, the mood of the companies in the EU at the moment is pretty daunted, and what needs changing is the regulations need formally adopting, and the implementing and delegated acts need drafting and adopting. So the outlook, well, I would say we still have a mountain to climb in terms of understanding the real impact of the regulations and implementing them.
Okay, well, thank you for these presentations and the very interesting comments and views that you've expressed. MedTech regulation is inherently complex and in some countries more than others, but both of you today have succeeded in making it a bit clearer. So thank you once again for your time today to David Filmore, Executive Editor of MedTech Insight, and to Amanda Maxwell, Regulatory Affairs Editor of MedTech Insight. And also thank you to the audience for listening in. Thank you.